Welcome to Velvet Nights. Lay down gently, let your body sink into comfort. Take a slow, deep breath in, and exhale the worries of the day. Feel your eyelids growing heavier with each breath. You're safe now, cocooned in the quiet of the night. Don't forget to subscribe, so the stories may carry you gently, night after night. Sleep peacefully as we begin tonight's tale of soft longing, unspoken desire, and the gentle magic of silent love. In the village of Laris, tucked between the sea and a sleeping forest, time moved slower. Cobbled streets curled like question marks, and soft golden lamps lined the alleys like warm breadcrumbs leading dreamers home. Atop the eastern cliff, the lighthouse stood, tall, whitewashed, and ever watchful. It pulsed like a heartbeat through fog and tide. And in that lighthouse lived Elias. He was a man of few words, kept company more by the sea than by souls. His hands were calloused from years of climbing iron staircases and polishing glass, and his voice, when heard, sounded like wind brushing over stone. But Elias had a secret. Every night, after the final sweep of the lantern, he watched the cliffs beyond the village, and every night, she was there, Sahara. She sat with her legs tucked beneath her, her back curved like a question mark, and her scarf dancing with the breeze. She never looked directly toward the lighthouse, but Elias felt her eyes on it, on him. He didn't know her name, not then, only her silhouette, her patience, her silence, and Sahara. She knew Elias by rhythm, by ritual, by the way the lighthouse beam paused, just barely on the western cliff whenever she arrived. She had watched him too, first by accident, then by routine, and then by something deeper. A softness bloomed in her chest each night as the beam swept across her. It was a language of light, not words, of presence, not noise. By day, Sahara ran her late father's bookshop in the heart of the village. Pages fluttered like wings when she passed, her fingers stained by ink and parchment. She'd inherited her father's quiet, his love for untold stories and half-finished thoughts. Customers adored her for her stillness, but none saw the ache she carried. She was alone, not lonely, never quite that, but alone in a way only the deeply loving could be, when they had no one to pour it into. And that's why, every night, she climbed the same hill with a small lantern of her own, and sat in silence, staring out at a lighthouse that to her felt like it pulsed just for her. She never imagined he saw her, and he never imagined she knew he did. Until the night the wind changed. A storm had teased the coastline all day, thick clouds like slow dancers across the horizon, and the air tense with quiet warning. Sahara should have stayed home, but habit and hope carried her to the cliff once more. The lantern light was already on, but it didn't sweep. It stayed still, a steady beam shining down toward the very edge where she sat. She froze. Inside the lighthouse, Elias's heart pounded. He never meant to hold the beam so long, but when he saw her, hair wild in the rising wind, her scarf flapping like a flag, he couldn't look away. A sudden urge pressed at his chest, to speak, to reach, to let the silence end. But silence had been his only language for so long. He turned away and let the beam resume. Sahara remained still for a moment longer. Then she smiled, a small, barely there curve of her lips, and she reached into her satchel, pulled out a piece of paper, and began to write. That night, Elias found it on his windowsill, folded with care, held down by a small seashell. I watch you light the sea. I wish I could tell you how safe it makes me feel. No name, no initials, but his chest bloomed warm. That night, he lit the lantern early and left the beam on her a little longer. The village of Lyris began to dream. Shutters closed gently against the sea's lullaby. Cats curled under bakers' carts, and above it all the lighthouse's beam pulsed like a slow heartbeat in the dark. Elias sat at his small wooden desk, the note before him. His fingertips hovered over the paper as if afraid touching it might make it disappear. He read the words again, not aloud, never aloud, and stared at the tiny shell she'd left atop it. I watch you light the sea. I wish I could tell you how safe it makes me feel. She had written it in deep blue ink, slanted letters, soft and steady, like someone used to writing in the dark. He didn't sleep that night. Not truly. His dreams were stitched from questions. Who was she? Why him? And what was he meant to do now? But when the sun rose and spilled pale honey across the lighthouse windows, Elias knew one thing. He wanted her to know. He had seen her too. He waited 3 days, not because he was unsure, but because he wanted her to notice something had changed. On the 4th night, he left something on the edge of the cliff. A small red lantern. Sahara found it just as the wind was beginning to settle. She stood above it, confused, heart beating strangely fast. She reached down and picked it up, light as air. Inside was a folded map of the coastline, with one small X marked on the ridge just below the lighthouse, where the wild thyme grew thick. She looked up at the beam. It paused on her again, just for a moment, and then moved on. She clutched the lantern to her chest and whispered, "He saw me." That night, in her father's old bookshop, she wrote again, "I've walked these cliffs since I was a child, but only since you began lighting them, that they ever felt like home." The notes continued. Always anonymous, always quiet. She'd leave hers nestled in hollow trees or tucked between rocks. He'd respond with a symbol. A light flickered twice in a row. A flare sent once at midnight, and once a single daisy pressed between 2 stones. That one made her cry. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something quieter, a recognition. A mirroring. 2 people who had spent years wrapping their hearts in silence, now folding back the layers, note by note. But Sahara had secrets. She'd been engaged once. His name was Marek, a charming traveler who spoke with a poet's tongue and smelled of cinnamon and old coins. He promised her stories in cities beyond the sea. But one summer evening, just before their wedding, Marek left. No letter, no goodbye, only a scarf of hers, returned neatly folded at her doorstep. It had crushed something inside her, not because he left, but because he hadn't dared to tell her why. He'd stolen the closure, the conversation. The silence afterward was more painful than any betrayal. And so she chose quiet for herself, until Elias. He too had scars hidden beneath soft gestures. Years before he took the job at the lighthouse, Elias had loved someone named Hélène. They were engaged, deeply in love, but the sea had other plans. A sudden voyage, a sudden storm. Her ship never returned. He never stood on a boat again. Instead, he chose the cliff, the light, a way to protect others from losing what he lost. But now, something had changed. Sahara's presence, her lantern, her letters, her steady silence. It felt like sunlight in a life of gray. One night, the village held a festival. Lanterns floated into the sky like soft stars, and music curled through the alleys like perfume. Sahara stood at the edge of the dance circle, her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes drifting toward the lighthouse. It was dark, strange. The beam hadn't flickered at all that night. She tried to ignore the hollow in her chest. But then, far off behind the trees, one small red lantern flickered twice. She turned instantly, her breath catching. The hill below the lighthouse was glowing with tiny lit stones, arranged carefully, almost nervously, into the shape of a spiral. At the center, another note. I know your silence. I've lived in it too, but it doesn't scare me anymore. Not when I see you. She held it to her chest. The lighthouse light returned 5 minutes later, bright and unwavering. In her dreams that night, the sea whispered his name. The days grew longer. Spring folded over Lyris like a warm shawl. Window boxes spilled with lilac and rosemary. The sea softened, trading its winter growl for a gentler hush. Still, each night, Sahara climbed the hill, and each night the light pulsed familiar, constant. It was no longer just a ritual. It had become a tether. They'd never spoken aloud. Not once. But the notes continued. Short, tender, like echoes of thoughts. Both were afraid to voice. When I can't sleep, I imagine your hands lighting the sky. Some people speak too much. I love that you don't. You carry quiet like a song. And from Elias, once, folded carefully inside a piece of parchment. I once thought loneliness was safety. Now I wonder what I've missed. Sahara pressed that one between pages of her favorite book. A story about a lost sailor who finds home in the light of a stranger. But even in the gentlest stories, something always stirs the stillness. And in Lyris, it arrived as a letter. One afternoon, Sahara stood in her bookshop sorting through deliveries. Among the usual orders, maps, old volumes, and pressed flower journals, lay a crisp envelope with the lighthouse seal. It was official and unexpected. She turned it over, hesitated, and opened it. Inside, a note in fine ink. Village Council invites the lighthouse keeper to speak publicly at the spring renewal gathering, honoring his 10 years of service. But why had it come to her? Moments later, the shop bell chimed. Elias, standing in her doorway, unsure. It was the first time they had seen each other up close. No cliffs between them. No lanterns. No shadows. Just two people in a sun-dappled shop, surrounded by stories and silence. I didn't know where else they'd send it, she said gently, holding up the envelope. They assumed I see you more than anyone. His eyes softened. He nodded once. I guess that's true. His voice, she noticed, was steady, warm, deeper than she expected, like a cello string, plucked once and left to echo. A long pause. Then Elias reached into his coat and offered her something. A single candle. Small, ivory white, handmade. For your windowsill, he said. In case the night ever feels too quiet. She took it in both hands, cradling it. Something shifted. That night, Elias did not return to the lighthouse immediately. He lingered near her shop, watching the sky bruise violet as the sun dipped low. Inside, Sahara sat with a candle. She didn't light it. just held it close to her heart. And far away, in the shadows of the cliffs, someone else was watching. An unfamiliar figure, wrapped in a long coat, hat low, eyes hidden. He wasn't from Lyris. The following evening, the stranger appeared again, this time near the path to the lighthouse. He spoke to no one, just stood, gazing upward. Elias saw him from the window and felt something stir, an old tension he hadn't felt in years. The man left before dusk. Sahara, too, noticed him. On the third night, he lingered near the bookshop. When she stepped outside to gather the lanterns, she found a note folded neatly on the steps. It wasn't Elias's writing. "You're still beautiful, Sahara. Do you still wear my scarf?" Her breath caught. The ink, cinnamon-colored. Her hand trembled. Merrick. After years of silence, he had returned. Without warning, without apology. The next night, she did not go to the cliffs. The lighthouse light swept, but found no silhouette. Inside, Elias felt the stillness like a wound. Something was wrong. He checked for notes. None. He lit the beam higher, longer. Still no sign of her. Meanwhile, Sahara sat in her darkened bookshop, holding the old scarf. It was faded now, frayed at the edges. She hadn't worn it in years, but she'd kept it. Why now? Why had Marek returned? Just as her heart was starting to unfold again. She didn't sleep, but she did write. The note was simple. "I'm sorry for the silence tonight. Something from my past returned, and I didn't know how to face it. But I missed the light." She left it the next morning near the cliffs. Elias found it at dawn, his hands cold, despite the rising sun. He folded the note gently, placed it beside the candle she'd once held, and made a decision. It was time to speak. The lighthouse had always been a place of watching, the period where day. To that morning, Elias descended its spiral stairs not as a keeper of the light, but as a man trying to follow something brighter than a lantern. He hadn't spoken to anyone in the village in weeks, maybe months. Most people had long accepted that about him. Elias didn't mingle. He didn't drink at the pub or stroll the market. He lit the sky, and that was enough. Until her. Now he found himself walking toward the bookshop. One hand curled around the edge of the letter she'd left him, the other tucked nervously in his coat. The bell above the door rang like a whisper. Sahara looked up from her desk, tired but composed. Her eyes softened the moment she saw him. "You came," she said, voice barely above a breath. "I couldn't stay in the tower," he replied. "Not after your note." There was a long silence, but this one felt different. Open, not afraid. He stepped closer. "I read your words again and again, and all I could think was, I never want you to feel alone in your silence again." Sahara's throat tightened. She nodded. "It's hard. When the past comes back, just when the heart starts to trust again." "Marek?" Elias asked gently. She nodded. "He left me once without a sound, and now he's back, speaking as if nothing ever happened, as if no silence was ever weaponized." Elias didn't press her. He simply sat, across from her, in the chair she often left empty. "I don't know what he wants," she said, after a while, "and I don't know what to say. To him, to myself, to you." Her voice broke slightly at the end. Elias leaned forward, placing something on the table between them. A compass. Old. Brass. Slightly scratched. It was Helen's, he said. The woman I once loved. She died at sea. I kept this, thinking it would help me stay pointed. But now I think, maybe, it's time to let the past be the past. Sahara's fingers brushed the compass lightly. I'm not asking you for answers, he said softly. I just want you to know, I see you, and I will never leave you wondering where you stand. Her breath caught, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached across the table, took his hand gently in hers, and held it there. That night, the lighthouse beam moved slower than usual. It paused not only on the cliffs, but lingered near the village, as if tracing a path from the sea to the heart of Lyris. In the shadows, Merrick watched. He had expected a woman still broken, still waiting. But she wasn't waiting. She was choosing. The next morning, Sahara found a bouquet at her doorstep. Wildflowers. No note, just the kind Merrick used to leave. She left them there. Instead, she walked to the lighthouse, daylight spilling over her shawl, and climbed the long, winding stairs. Elias opened the door before she knocked. For the first time, she saw the inside. The copper gears, the wooden journals, the small window where he watched the sea. It smelled like salt and candle wax. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. She stayed until sunset, watching the way he adjusted the lens, how his hands moved with memory. And when the light finally turned on, she stood beside him, the beams sweeping out together, touching the same places it always did, but now from the same side. I used to wonder if you were even real, she said quietly. I did too, he whispered back. Down in the village, the festival loomed, the spring renewal gathering. The one Elias had always declined to attend was days away. This time, he didn't decline, and neither did she. The entire village buzzed with whispers. They had never seen the lighthouse keeper among them before, and certainly never with anyone on his arm. But when the day arrived, Elias stood beside Sahara in the town square, her hand gently looped through his. He wore his old coat, the one lined with sea maps. She wore a blue dress with pockets stitched by her mother, and just as the mayor called Elias forward to thank him for a decade of quiet service, Marek stepped into the crowd. He wore the same smug smile, the same cologne. But when he tried to meet Sahara's gaze, she looked away, not with anger, but with peace. Because now she saw the difference between silence that wounds and silence that heals. When the speech ended, Elias didn't say much, just stood at the podium, looked at the sea, and then at her. He said, I've spent 10 years lighting the way for ships I'd never meet. I never thought someone might be lighting the way for me. Thank you, Sahara. Her eyes welled. The crowd clapped, and Marek vanished into it, out of place in a town that had long since stopped waiting for his kind. That night, they climbed the hill one last time. Just the two of them. No notes, no lanterns, only the stars. They sat in silence, shoulder to shoulder. And somewhere between one breath and the next, Sahara leaned her head on his shoulder. He didn't move, only placed his hand gently over hers. Two people who had loved in silence, now loving in stillness. A month passed. Lyris moved through its quiet rhythm. Waves rolled in and out, gulls called overhead, and the villagers smiled more when they passed the bookshop window and saw two silhouettes inside, one bending over tea, the other reading something aloud. Sahara and Elias did not rush into declarations, they simply lived closer. She still walked the cliffs, but now when she looked up at the lighthouse, she didn't feel longing, she felt known. Elias still lit the sea each night, but now when the light returned to him, he imagined it had touched her shoulder first. One morning, Sahara found something peculiar, an old box tucked in the back of her father's storage room. She hadn't noticed it in years. Dusty, with a brass clasp and her name carved faintly into the wood. Inside were old letters. Letters Merrick had written, but never sent. Dozens of them. Some angry, some tender. All from the year after he left. One, dated 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, stood out. Sahara, I left because I couldn't be who you saw in me. You believed I was more than I was. That terrified me. I see now what a coward I became. I hope someday someone sees you the way I couldn't. She folded it gently, and then, without bitterness, tossed it into the fireplace. Some truths matter in the moment. Others are meant to burn. That night, she walked to the lighthouse again. She didn't knock. He opened the door without her needing to. I found something, she said, stepping inside. But it doesn't matter anymore. He looked at her with that quiet question in his eyes, and she answered it without words. She kissed him, soft, like a page turning. The kind of kiss that doesn't rush. The kind of kiss that knows how long it's waited. Later, as the beam swept the dark sea, she stood beside him once more. He reached for her hand, instinctively, and she squeezed back. Then he turned to her, voice barely louder than the flame behind the lens. Do you still love me in silence? She smiled. No, she said. Now I love you in the light. From the cliffs, the village, and the drifting waves, the sea held its breath. And for once, it wasn't longing they felt. It was rest. Down in the village, children still told stories of a woman who spoke in letters, of a man who answered with light, of a love that never shouted, only whispered, patiently, until it was safe to bloom. Some nights, people said, if you stood by the cliffs and closed your eyes, you could still feel them there, not as ghosts, but as a promise that love doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in stillness, in the hush between heartbeats, in the moment someone finally sees you and stays. So as you rest now, let your breath deepen. Let the waves inside you quiet. Let the lighthouse guide you gently across the waters of your own heart. Sleep peacefully. You are seen. You are safe. You are home.